So if you could back up a little bit in terms of theory, and when we talk about economic efficiency, which is basically the ability of a system to achieve emissions reduction at the lowest cost. So in theory, are some systems better than others? But what is the what do you actually see in practice?
Both of these systems put a price on carbon, and so to an individual emitter, they do the same thing. It's interesting. And that's not always. I don't think that always is apparent. And so I dug up from about, I guess now it's about a month and a half ago, the prices for gasoline that went on sale in Quebec compared to other parts of Canada. And I wish I had the figure here, but it's you can see right at the beginning of this year there was a big upward blip of about 2.5 cents a liter in Quebec's through the province, the Quebec price of gasoline compared to everywhere else in the country. And the reason is that Quebec's cap and trade system, as of the beginning of this year, extended to cover transportation fuels. And so the price of these allowances all of a sudden got reflected in the price of gasoline and diesel that went on sale in Quebec. From an individual gasoline consumer, all you're seeing is the price of gasoline go up. It doesn't matter if it's a tax that's driving the price of gasoline up or an allowance price that's paid by the refinery that's driving the price of gasoline up. It's going to cause me to make the same kind of decisions, right? It's going to cause me to kind of reevaluate that hydrocar purchase that I was thinking about and say, oh, look, now gasoline's that much more expensive. It really does justify the hydrocar as opposed to whatever else I was going to buy. Or instead of driving to work, I'm going to take a bus to work because gasoline's that much more expensive. And so it should cause the same kinds of decisions to be made no matter what the instrument chosen is. And so I would say, at least at first order, these two kind of characters that we're talking about, the cap and trade and the carbon tax, offer the exact same kind of incentives, and as a result, leave efficiency kind of in the same spot. There's some nuances that maybe someone else can get into. But
this question of economic efficiency and industrial competitiveness, as it's outlined here, and it's a backslash. And I just wanted to sort of lay a couple sort of ideas on the table, introduce some concepts. So the economic efficiency, you get it with a well-designed carbon pricing system, cap and trade, or carbon tax. Broad coverage, so you bring in all kinds of emitters. You allow them to basically make flexible choices about whether they're going to abate or whether they're going to pay a tax or whether they're going to buy emissions from somewhere else. And you sort of seek out the lowest cost reductions everywhere, and on aggregate, you have reduced costs. So that has a competitiveness impact. And given the scope of these systems now, BC's system, California's system, Quebec's system, it's not just industrial competitiveness. There's service sectors involved. There's light manufacturing getting impacted by energy prices. It's not just the big heavy emitters. So that's the first thing. So it's competitiveness writ large. So another thing you need to think about is, so you make this choice on instrument. Who are we going to cover? Are we going to have price certainty, quantity certainty, cap and trade, etc. And then what are we going to do with the revenue? Are we going to collect revenue? So you can carve out a whole bunch of people out of the carbon tax system, meaning they don't pay for it, or you can give them free allocations, which means they don't have to go to the market and buy them, so there's no revenue. Or you can make them pay and you can recycle it back, like BC does, and reduce income taxes. Now, one of the vignettes earlier said, hey, cap and dividend. You as a household, you're going to get 2/3 what you pay. So there's the winner. Who's the loser? Well, all that money's coming out of competitiveness. Okay, so to the extent you're applying this price on emissions to the industrial sector, the service sector, all these other groups that interact through the economy, you're going to have bigger competitiveness impacts. So you have to sort of have this trade-off. So anyway, that's the next question. I'll stop there. So you have to allocate revenue if you're going to get revenue out of the system. And then there is this fairness dimension. So how, to the extent you want a big dividend coming back to houses, well, there are losers. And then can you live with that competitiveness impact? Is that something you want? So.
Just on the note of competitiveness, you wrote a policy brief in 2013 for sustainable prosperity, and you looked at what impact I think by $40 by 2030 would have on Ontario industries. What is it that you've found?
Well, I'll kick it over to Nick to make done some way more interesting work on this. But so the presumption that somebody is there's a competitive disadvantage, or a household, there's a regressive impact on a low-income household, that presumption is usually overblown. And you have to scratch much deeper. You can't just basically start cutting. So you cut checks, you give out these checks as the bribe to start the system, like they did in BC. You cut a bunch of checks to keep everybody happy, windfall, windfall, windfall. But then you have to be really careful that you don't say, oh, cement's hurt, or chemical sector's hurt. And the point was in Ontario that the chemical sector is using clean hydro versus their competitors in the US who use dirty coal. And with the same prices, the Ontario folks that have carbon prices, the Ontario folks would be better off. So there wasn't necessarily competitive in this misalignment, even though the industry and the households would be screaming about being disadvantaged. And Nick did some great work in BC on rural, urban, and greenhouse stuff.
Well, I'll just say very quickly on the competitiveness side of things, this is the front burner issue for government. Our industry is going to close because we bring in a carbon pricing system. And there's been a lot of study, and most of it doesn't find anything. Most of it, now we've got a bunch of carbon prices, we've got lots of 40-year history of regulating the environment in developed countries. And most of the studies that have come out, even big surveys that kind of look through hundreds of studies, the conclusion generally is we can't find anything. There's no evidence, at least with the existing environmental regulations, that there's we can't find statistically an adverse impact on industrial competitiveness from the existing set of environmental regulations that we have. And that includes the studies that have covered the nascent carbon pricing schemes in Europe and in North America. So certainly if we went way out of line and kind of brought in a carbon policy, a cap and trade system, or carbon tax that would get us to our 2050 goals, and we brought it in today, we didn't tell anyone, we would expect to see big structural change in the economy. But if we do what BC's done, or what Quebec's done, or what California's done, or even what Europe's done, we're unlikely to be able to statistically discern any impact on competitiveness, any impact on Ontario firms being able to not being able to export to other regions because they get priced out of the market. We just, these signals are so small relative to the other costs that are going into a firm that they just wash out. Especially when we start thinking about some of the stuff that Dave's saying, which is like what BC basically did a tax switch. So it cut, and more or less, most of the tax cuts were corporate income tax cuts. Most of the tax increases were carbon tax increases. So the tax increase was carbon tax, and it was offset by mostly a corporate income tax cut. So for a business, this is in one hand and out of the other, right? It doesn't really affect the bottom line all that much. And so if the system it does affect their decisions. Now all of a sudden they're paying less on their profits and more on their carbon. So they start saying, how can we ratchet up our profits and ratchet up our carbon? It's not a system, at least at these modest levels, that really seems to have a big impact on competitiveness.
I'm curious if I might ask a question, a follow-up as a panelist
Here, if the studies are not showing a negative impact in terms of competitiveness of a business, there aren't businesses shutting down as a result of a price on carbon. Are you, as you were saying towards the end, is there a demonstrable positive influence? Are we actually seeing a shift in their inputs, in their decision making, either considerable improvements in energy efficiency or choices to get out of certain product lines or something like that?
We can see, there's been studies, for example, the EU has a cap and trade system that covers most of the countries. It's had one since, in various stages since about 2005. And so now we're getting wave upon wave of studies that use really detailed manufacturing census data. So they have data on each firm in each year, all the kinds of fuels they use, how many people they employ, what they export to which markets, they have lots of data on these firms. It's at the individual firm level, or even the individual facility level in some cases. And so we can see that they're cutting pollution. In the UK's climate change levy, we can see an 18% improvement in energy intensity as a result of this climate change levy, which is a carbon tax. Same thing in German study that looks at the impact of the EU ETS. And they can also track things like employment, exports, and firm opening and closings, and they find no evidence of any effect. So again, it's a modest policy. It's not going to get Europe to zero emissions. other places that we weren't going to devastate